In this video, we will look at a very important aspect of a Spring Boot application, exception handling. Though you can use Java's try-catch blocks, but the problem is that you have to place them at all places where you need to handle an exception. Further, with this approach, you cannot centralize exception handling. That is, you cannot create a common code for handling exceptions in your application. This video will make you understand 3 different ways in which you can add exception handling mechanism using Spring Way. Do watch it till the end. Let us first start from scratch by creating a new Spring project. Though this has been done in an earlier video where we created a Spring REST API from scratch. The IDE being used here is STS, Spring Tool Suite. Go to File and search for Spring Starter Project. Fill in the details such as project name, which Java version to use, how to package the application such as jar or war, which build tool to use such as Gradle or Maven. Fill in the project description. Click Next. Select the dependencies to use. Since we will be creating a web application, use Spring Web. Click Finish. Look, it created a Spring Boot project having a class with main method and Spring Boot application annotation. All this is a part of creating a Spring Boot REST application. To learn how to create a REST application with Spring Boot, watch a previous video. Link is at the top right corner. Create a controller class and annotate it with REST controller annotation to make it a Spring controller. Define a new method that returns a string. Add a getMapping annotation. Any request with URL /user will be handled or will arrive at this method. We will just check if it works. Start the application. It started the application at port 8080. Go to the browser. Hit URL localhost :8080/user. We get the message. So, our Spring REST application is up and running. Now, to understand exception handling in Spring Boot, first, let's create a custom exception class. Name it NotFoundException. This class should extend Java's exception class, since all custom exceptions should extend this class only. Back to the controller class. Throw this exception based on a condition. For this video, make this condition as true so that the exception is always thrown. In real applications, this should never be done. Since the method throws an exception, it needs to declare. Now, when this method will be invoked, this exception will be thrown and we will get an error instead of a proper response as before. Restart the application and go to the browser. Refresh. Look, we get an error and the error status is 500, which means server error. We have created an error condition in a Spring Boot application. Now, we will see how to handle exceptions in it. First way is to create an exception handler method in this class. To indicate that it will be handling an exception, we need to annotate it with exception handler annotation, followed by the type of exception that it will take care. This means that whenever NotFoundException will be thrown, the control will arrive at this method. We can also customize the response code returned by using response status annotation, followed by the response code. Set it to bad request, which has an error code 400. Restart the application. Back to the browser. Refresh. Look, we get 400 as the response code. If you are using Thymeleaf or any other view such as JSP, then you can return your own error page from this method by changing the return type to string. The problem with earlier exception handling approach is that it is limited to this controller class only. That is, if this exception is thrown from any method in this controller, then it will be handled. But if it is thrown from elsewhere, then this won't work. So, let's look at a second approach. Comment this out. Go to the exception class that we created earlier and apply response status annotation here. Provide a value with not found or 404 status code and a reason. This reason would not be visible if the request comes from a browser, as in this case, but you can get it if you use Postman or any other API tool. Restart. Back to the browser. Refresh the page and it shows 404 status now. With this method, if not found exception is thrown from any controller class throughout the application, this error code and reason will be sent as response. Thus, we have centralized exception handling and made the response code at one single place. You would be getting a question here. If both the approaches are used simultaneously, then what will be the result? If both ways are used, then the method written in the controller will be preferred. To verify, uncomment this code, restart the application and go back to the browser. Hit refresh. Look, we get 400 as a status code which was provided in the controller method. The problem with second method is that it can only handle a particular exception type, not found exception in this case. Thus, this technique does not address handling exceptions of different types at a single place. This is where third approach becomes useful. To understand it, create a new class, name it Global Exception Handler, add controller advice annotation. Controller advice annotation makes this class discoverable as a Spring Bean. With this annotation applied over a class, you can add multiple exception handler methods to handle exceptions of different types. Method of exception handling is the same as in earlier two methods. Define a method that will act as exception handler. To associate it with an exception type, add exception handler annotation and define the exception type. To customize the response code, you can also add response status as before. This method handles a not found exception that we have created. Define another method to handle Java's exception class. Change the response code so that we can verify that it is actually working. Controller advice annotation gives you the flexibility of defining the application's exception handling logic at one place. Any of these exceptions thrown from any controller throughout the application will arrive here. Comment the other two exception handling methods. Controller method is throwing not found exception, so this method should handle the exception and the response code should be bad request, which is 400. Restart the application. Go to the browser and hit refresh. Look, we get 400. Back to the controller method. Change the type of exception thrown to exception. Change the method signature as well. Restart the application. We should now get the response code for conflict, which is 409. Back to the browser. Refresh. 409 it is. That is all for this video. Hope the video was useful to understand the concept of exception handling in Spring Boot.